So, you want to switch away from WASD. You're smarter than most. While I'm not some kind of a pro player, I do think that there's an efficacy or efficiency angle to switching away from WASD for players of all skill levels. Additionally, for higher skilled players who are playing at a level where each input matters more, you may receive additional benefit from tightening your mechanics by going away from the default controls. So, while I'll make no assertions that I'm anything but an intermediate level player, I hope that this doesn't prevent both less and more skilled players than me from thinking about the efficiency of their keybinds. If you're familiar with console gaming, just think about this like the addition of bumper jumper as a control scheme to the Halo franchise. This control scheme allowed the player to keep their thumbs on the movement and aiming sticks, their fingers ready to fire and throw grenades, while also allowing the player to jump and throw melee attacks. It also prevented high-level players from having to do contortionist positions with their hands, such as the claw, where the player would use their pointer finger in order to press the face buttons. While there are noobs that play with bumper jumper, and there are still pros that play with the default controls, the bumper jumper control scheme provided an efficiency and a comfort argument for players of all skill levels. In the same way, I think that switching away from WASD and towards a better and more considered control scheme could offer similar benefits. Just keep in mind that WASD is sort of the default control scheme for a player who uses the keyboard with their left hand and the mouse with the right. Not necessarily a right-handed player, but somebody who uses that configuration. The equivalent of WASD for a player that plays with their right hand on the keyboard is to either use the arrow keys or some sort of configuration like PL: and the apostrophe key on an American keyboard. While both of these control schemes are still somewhat effective, they're antiquated because of the amount of special functions in modern games. In a game that's traditionally played with WASD, the free finger that you have is your pinky. Your pinky is not immediately responsible for controlling your character. Really, its only job is to press shift or control in most games in order to put you in a crouching stance or in a sprinting stance. The other three fingers on that hand are already overtaxed with having to move your character as well as selecting weapons. For many players, the thumb is already bound to an important and immediately necessary action as well. Your thumb in most situations will be on the spacebar, which for some players might be jump, which I think is suboptimal. It could also be in charge of some kind of a zoom in function. A lot of people put zoom in some games on B or on the spacebar or something like that. This key configuration was working at least okay when games were more basic. WASD reigned at a time where games like CS 1.6 had only just come out and were taking over from games like Quake and Half-Life Deathmatch. For reference, some of the first games to ship with WASD as default were actually the Valve Gold Source engine games. This isn't to say that the Half-Life games are responsible for creating the WASD control scheme. In fact, many players were actually using this scheme and one similar to it for a long time before. However, this does serve as a good point of reference for when this scheme started to gain traction, the games that it was tailored to. While some games haven't changed very much since the late 90s and the early 2000s, the requirements for competing in them often have, as the metas have developed and players have discovered more of the mechanical depth of these games. So in the same way that we consider changing our playstyle in response to a current meta, we should also consider the buttons that we play with. What was required in a competitive multiplayer shooter back then was less understood. If you don't play competitive multiplayer shooters of that type, there still is a lot of value in switching away from WASD. For example, in tactical games or military simulation style games, you might have buttons to call in ordnance from off the board, or switch the fire modes of your weapon, or numerous different stance changes. The mouse will almost always be occupied for most players. The left mouse button for most players is already set to fire. The right mouse button, depending on the era that you started playing PC games, might be for walk forward, it could be for jumping, or it could be for zooming in if you're a newer player. The side buttons of the mouse are often going to be bound to things like doing a quick melee attack or maybe pulling out a small selection of weapons. It's ideal to not have too many functions on the mouse, as anything that you have to input using the mouse is going to affect your point of aim. We start to run into a problem when you consider modern arena shooters which have a large selection of weapons, modern military simulation games, which might have a variety of different fire modes and other functions, and now players need additional single-action jump and throw binds on their keyboard for the newest version of Counter-Strike to get vital grenades where their team needs them most. So if we're unable to put anything else on our primary fingers that are controlling movement and potentially switching weapons. And additionally, our mouse is bound up, and even if it isn't, we don't want to be affecting our aim too much. Then we're going to need more buttons, and ideally these are going to be buttons operated by our pinky. These bind suggestions are assuming that you use your keyboard with your left hand when you're playing first-person shooters. Players who use the keyboard with their right hand, just follow along by doing a mirror image of what I'm suggesting, moving your keys to the left. In response to the control demands for newer games, I moved my movement keys to RDFG several years ago. The reason why I did this was to get access to almost every button on the left side of my keyboard. And most importantly, many of these buttons that I'm freeing up can be operated by my pinky. Whereas before I would be pressing buttons like Shift, Control, and Tab using my pinky, and otherwise it wasn't able to hit anything else effectively. Now, in addition to being able to hit Shift and Tab, I can easily operate Q, W, A, S, and Z using my pinky. The Control key is now harder to reach, but normally I remap whatever its function is to the Z key. For reference, on WASD, discounting the tilde key, as that often opens the console, I could easily press Tab, Caps Lock, Shift, and Control. So I had 4 easily accessible buttons for my pinky. I now have Tab, Caps Lock, Shift, Control, Q, A, Z, W, S, and maybe even X. So for games with single-purpose actions or niche actions, I maybe had access to 4 or 5 different ones with my previous control scheme on WASD. I now have the option to bind about 9 such actions without having to take my fingers off of the movement keys. For reference, even if you have short fingers and you can only play with something like ESDF, you still go up from having 4 buttons available to having about 6. For arena style games, which are my favorite games to play, like Quake or Doom or Unreal Tournament, I can bind buttons like Q, W, A, and S to pulling out different weapons. These weapons can be drawn without me having to take fingers off of my movement keys or screwing up my aim on the mouse. In more simulation or realistic styled games, I'll use Z and X to be my crouch and prone button respectively. Q, W, A, and S now can be bound to different functions in the game, like changing fire modes or affixing bayonets. And I can do any one of these options without my ability to immediately move, aim, or fire being negatively affected. In CS, Z becomes my crouch button, Shift remains my slow walk button. Q, W, A, and S become the different single actions that you need to do to perform jump throws. These actions have become easier in CS2, however, it's still important to have buttons bound for these actions so that you can be as consistent and accurate as possible. For example, Q jumps my player character, while A releases the grenade. I can hit both of these keys in the same motion. This means that almost all of the work of a standard jump throw is done by a single press of a single finger. My movement keys are also not affected by this. This means that I can use my normal plus forward button, which for me is R, to do a running jump throw or a forward tap jump throw without affecting my point of aim. And if I had to try and run away quickly or pull out a weapon and return fire, I would be able to perform those actions easily and quickly, as those are bound for different fingers. I also have the S key bound to -attack 2. This means that I can do the soft release of the grenade with the same finger. While it would be difficult to press Q, A, and S in the same motion, pressing A and S simultaneously is relatively easy once you get practice on it. This allows you to effectively and consistently release a grenade with the medium level of velocity. Less than a normal throw, but also considerably more than the standard attack 2 drop the grenade at your feet type throw. If you time this with a jump using another finger, you'll have a very consistent middle click jump throw. And importantly, you can still go into other actions from this. In bind heavy games like CS2, you may still have to slip another finger over occasionally. However, with so many buttons operable just by your pinky, the frequency with which you'll have to do this will be lower. If the suggestions that I've made regarding jump throws seem uncomfortable to you, additionally, you could bind Q, W, A, and S to be able to draw the exact grenade that you want immediately or switch weapons. And I think that this kind of a control configuration might even be a better use of these keys than the jump throw options. If you're not able to take anything else away from this video, just know that the default controls for a game are not always the best controls, and they're almost never the best possible control options for you. Your controls and binds in a game should be almost like testing and adjusting a piece of sports equipment. It needs to be comfortable for you, but it also needs to effectively do the job that you got it for. The out-of-the-box controls are just a starting point. They're sort of a lowest common denominator or a catch-all for everyone who boots up the game for the first time. While you might be used to the standard FPS controls by this point, that's not in itself a reason to stick with them. And if any of these options or suggestions have sounded interesting to you, then I would urge you to give something other than WASD a try. Thank you very much for listening. Let me know if there's any other control options that I should consider in the comments. Hopefully, next time you check this channel, I'll be back to my more standard fare.